In 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Well, it's that time once again, another Integrated Interventions podcast. I'm glad that you could join us. Today's guest is our clinical director, Joshua Westby. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, appreciate you having us here to be able to talk about today's topic. We're going to be focusing on raising awareness and educating people about the LGBTQIA plus community and celebrating their history. You're an awesome guest to have today because of the background and also your knowledge of in history of the topic. And you also are kind of our go-to person when it comes to doing trainings within the company, as well as people who may have questions in relation to like LGBTQ, the community and all the topics that we're covering today. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. So can we talk about History Month? Which is in October, but Pride Month is in June. So can you talk about the similarities and differences between these two months, although the theme is unifying?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. When we look at the LGBT community, when we think about where the community is moving forward, areas where we're still fighting for equality or being visible, things like that, that's celebrated in June. Right? Through pride events, usually in your local communities, you'll see pride marches, things like that. There's a big push for awareness in June when it comes to LGBTQIA plus community. In October, we celebrate where we've been. So that's the history that's led up to this point, the power and the struggles that we've gone through, the successes, things that help us to orient towards those future areas that we still are fighting for today.
What is significant about June that they would choose that to be Pride Month?
Yeah, so June is really historic. It goes back to the Stonewall riots in New York City, which is kind of the firing off or the epicenter of the LGBT movement. It's where everything started when it comes to marches and uniting for a common theme of equality. From there, it's done nothing but grow, but we still celebrate in June because of that original Stonewall riot.
So when we started the podcast, we were talking about descriptions in relation to awareness and education. Originally, we started as LGBT History Month, being in October, and then we talk about LGBTQIA+. Now, in the beginning, if you want to go back from a historical perspective, there was a few letters that were left out. But that's also been because the community has grown, evolved, and changed. Can you talk about why that is and why it started out with just the first four, but now we've added a few more, and exactly kind of break down what each letter stands for?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question that highlights a level of infighting that's happened within the LGBT community pretty much from day one. Identifying those letters and what order they go, which ones are included or not, has been a topic of discussion pretty much from the beginning. We always think of lesbian and gay people as being the token or the pillar of the queer community, and we didn't really know in the beginning whether or not we wanted to include trans individuals, because where sexual orientation has a sexual component to it, transgender is gender identity, not sexual orientation. And then when we talk about the Q in LGBTQ, what that letter stands for depends on how you define it. Some people consider that to be questioning, that's space for individuals that aren't really sure where they fit in the heteronormative spectrum of sexual orientation, right? And some people call that queer, identifying that there's other things outside of lesbian, gay, and transgender that needs to be incorporated in this group, but that haven't been defined. Over time, we've tried to define that better by adding more letters, right? So that's where we get the I for intersex, although some argue that even that shouldn't be included because intersex is generally a situation from birth, not a sexual orientation or gender expression or gender identity. And then when we add in the A, some people consider that to stand for asexual, meaning that there's no sexual component in their life at all. Others consider that to be allies, people who are involved in the process who fall more into a heterosexual identity than any other. And then the plus was added because we needed a catch-all for everybody else that doesn't fall neatly into any one area. All of this is to say that we spent a lot of time trying to label people instead of just accepting people for being different than the heteronormative expectation that our society had all the way up until today.
You mentioned gender expression and gender identity. Can you elaborate on that topic, please?
Yeah, so there's typically 3 different components when we think about LGBT populations. There's gender identity, which is how I identify. That's an internal thing. It's built off of social norms. And so we're connecting male and female to that, right? Or some people who find themselves somewhere in the middle because they don't conform to one side or the other. Gender expression is how I express that gender identity. For instance, it's a social norm for women to wear dresses. So if I feel that I fall on the feminine side of gender identity, I'm going to express that through things like wearing a dress. And then you have sexual orientation, and that has to do with what you are attracted to in another person. So I may be attracted to femininity in men or women, or masculinity in men or women, but it's going to be what I'm attracted to. And generally speaking, we try to boil that down into binary options because that's where Western culture likes to be. So you're male or you're female, you're masculine or you're feminine, you're heterosexual, meaning that you have opposite sex partners, or you're homosexual, meaning you have same-sex partners.
Where does gender fluidity play into that?
Yeah, so gender fluid is a really interesting component because it's a place of being where we don't fit into any one category well. I think in Western culture, if we spent less time trying to create these binary norms and we spent more time really trying to understand who we are and what we like, we would all spend more time in the middle, kind of fluidly, kind of bouncing between the two. So gender fluidity says that I may feel gender expression today very masculine, where tomorrow you may see me wearing heels to work because I like high heels, not because they're feminine, but because they make my legs look good, or because they make my legs look more feminine, which I find to look good. So it can be a whole spectrum of really going with how I feel versus trying to fit those social norms.
You had referenced Western culture as kind of trying to define it in a certain way. Are there other cultures outside of Western culture that view it differently?
Yeah, so anybody who spends any time educating themselves on LGBT populations at some point is going to spend time in Native American populations, and where the idea of two-spirited comes up quite a bit. Native American populations for a long time have understood that there are those who flow kind of in between genders, and they don't fit any particular gender norm. We say that that's like the birth of trans comes from, that there's an understanding within Native American cultures that says that it's longstanding well before Western civilization got here and became what it is today. But there are lots of cultures throughout the world that utilize sexual expression and sexual identity significantly different than we do.
You've touched on the Stonewall riots earlier in the conversation. What other historical events are also very significant to be included within the month of October?
So when we look at LGBT history, and part of why having a history, having time to understand and celebrate that history is so important, is that much of it happened before the age of the internet, where history was a lot more localized than it is now. The Stonewall riots were huge at the time that they were happening in New York, but it wasn't so significant to the rest of the country, right? A gay farmer's son in Nebraska probably didn't know that there was a fight for equality going on in New York and DC. There are lots of events that have happened that are pivotal to what's become of the LGBT community today. Things like deaths of LGBT youth, right? When you think of the Trevor Project as we know it today, that's a story of a 13-year-old boy who kills himself. There are lots of other examples of human beings that feel ostracized for their sexual orientation or sexual identity, or gender expression, and are murdered or kill themselves. When we think more recent history, I think of the movie Brokeback Mountain and how controversial that was when it came out. I think of California's proposition to ban gay marriage in 2008, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was originally created by Bill Clinton as a way of trying to appease as many people as he could, only to realize that it did not do what he meant it to do at all. And that happened in 2012, to where we're at today with marriage equality a couple of years ago at the Supreme Court, and Congress at this session arguing and debating whether or not to codify same-sex marriage as a fundamental right.
What about Matthew Shepard?
Yeah, Matthew Shepard's a really good example too. When we talk about violence towards LGBT populations, I'm very lucky. I've lived in rural communities my entire life. I've worked with queer populations in the LGBT community for over 11 years now. I've never experienced that level of violence or harm towards me that some of our other community members have. But yeah, Matthew Shepard's a really good example of what can happen if we don't spend time focusing on not only furthering rights, but educating people to understand that different is okay.
Well, the purpose of today's podcast, too, is to look at historical perspectives and to just kind of an overall conversation to be able to maybe educate someone that didn't have familiarity with this topic. Mm-hmm. There's been a big push to educate the population as a whole, because I feel like education is a huge part of being able to reduce stereotypes, stigmas, or misinformation that people may have in relation to the LGBTQIA community. What are some of those education efforts that are platforms that people have been exploring in order to get that message out?
Yeah, good question. So you're absolutely right. One of the things that's interesting about the LGBT population, I'm going to boil it down a little bit more and reclassify it as gay rights, because that's how we generally think about it in our society. It happened all at once, right? When you think about interracial marriages, right? It took a long time of fighting to get to a point where interracial marriages were accepted as a social norm. You go back 15 years ago, and the majority of the United States did not believe in same-sex marriage. Today, the majority of the population believes in same-sex marriage. In fact, the majority of the Republican Party, who's generally been at opposition of same-sex marriage, believes in same-sex marriage. And it happened very quickly. And so today, a lot of people, when you bring up gay rights, say, "Oh, it's been solved. The problem is over," and they don't recognize that there are still many states in our country where you can be denied housing for having a same-sex partner. You can be fired from your job. That you can be denied insurance. There are so many things that are still going on that we don't think about because the big picture says it's all been resolved. The fact that I can be married today in the state of Idaho is thanks to a Supreme Court precedent that could at some point be overturned, which would nullify my marriage in the state of Idaho. I don't know what that would mean. And there's thousands and thousands of queer couples out there that have that same question, right? They have to live in that level of fear of what happens if tomorrow it all falls apart again, because nothing's been codified into a constitutional amendment or a law. And so there's a lot of work still left to be done. You can boil that back even further to giving voice to those who don't recognize that this population even exists. The internet really came of age in that 2008 era. Social media became really big. And for the first time, people really got to understand that there are other people like them in the world that are going through similar struggles. And whenever we can educate people that they're not alone, we're doing a good thing. So I think of the Trevor Project that helps people that are dealing with suicidal thoughts around their sexual orientation. I think of the It Gets Better Project that spends time putting people on screen and showing that there are other people who have been through things like this and have progressed through it. I think about the campaigns that go on within cities and states that push to the front the conversation that it's not over just because we've made progress. And that can really be observed in the Pride event that happened in Coeur d'Alene this year, where a U-Haul filled with armed men showed up to protest, right? We need to continue to show that equality is a good thing, that differences deserve to be celebrated, and at the end of the day, who I am married to or what I choose to do in my marital bed is of really no other person's business but mine.
In terms of a podcast, I always learn a lot. Every podcast on a topic, but I've learned a ton when it comes to this specific topic that we've been exploring today. And I've also learned about some kind of startling statistics that I was not aware of. Can you touch on those statistics and what that means for the greater community at large?
I'm not a huge fan of statistics as a way of proving a point because it dehumanizes the experience. What I can share is that the majority of LGBT youth are going to have suicidal thoughts and put a plan together before they turn 18. LGBT populations are at more risk of harm towards them than other populations. Trans women of color specifically, it's 80 or 90% of trans women are going to have violence enacted against them at some point in their life. It's really startling stuff when you look at homelessness is greatly affected by being part of the LGBT community, unemployment, pretty much any facet of life. If there's a disadvantage, LGBT populations are gonna have it.
Josh, when you talk about your role within integrated interventions in terms of the training aspect that you bring to the team, you have been called upon many times to talk to and deliver trainings to the employees here at Integrated Interventions.
Yeah, I don't consider myself an expert. I don't have a lot of education directly in LGBT studies or anything like that. I'm considered a subject matter authority. I've been working in this arena for over 11 years now, starting all the way back creating coalitions in Minot, North Dakota, creating safe spaces and community events there, working with the Phoenix Pride organization as their counselor on staff. I've had a lot of time to work in this arena and get to know people, as well as the fact that I'm in a same-sex marriage, which doesn't qualify me to be an expert or an authority, but does help to show that I kind of am a part of the community. So I do get called on from time to time to do trainings here at Integrated. It can be as small as a one-on-one training working with a staff who is misgendering a student and needs to understand the importance of what they're doing, all the way to large educational settings where I'm teaching our entire staff of over 100 on what the alphabet soup of LGBTQIA plus means, what gender expression and gender identity are, what sexual orientation is, and really trying to put together the pieces in an hour highlight reel of here's the history, here's the fight, here's where we still struggle, here's how you can support. I don't try to force staff to believe that equality is important or that they have to go and love every gay person they meet on the planet. I don't love every gay person I've met on the planet, right? It's not a requirement, but what is a requirement is respect and dignity of people. And that can be provided to anybody, our students included, whether we agree with them or not, whether we support what they're saying or doing or not, and provide education so that staff members can, if they're going to be bigoted, at least be an educated bigot.
At Integrated, we welcome all people, and it's something that we're very proud of. Can you speak to more of how we work with individuals within the LGBTQIA community?
Yeah. We work with them the same as we work with anybody else, because if we've learned nothing from this podcast today, it's that sexual identity, sexual expression, and sexual orientation really aren't anything that needs to require a bunch of change from everybody else. So for our trans populations, for our gay students, it doesn't change what we do. Obviously, we want to be accepting and provide space where we can explore those themes, especially in the therapeutic component. But overall, we want to provide the space for students to grow, recognizing that it doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is if you need to get a job. You need to get a job. Work ethic is important. Being able to pay your bills is important. Having appropriate interpersonal relationships and communication with others is important. And although we can incorporate sexual expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation into the work that we do, ultimately we can work with any student in any area of the queer community because it's really down to where the student is or where they're trying to go and how we can help them to get where they're going, and not about focusing on those aspects of them the same way that we don't focus on race or gender, age, body type. It's really not important to the work that we do.
How do you address the situation when a person says, this is the reason why I'm not getting a job, and they, release said specific reason?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a deep question. And it's times that it happens. We have worked with students in the past where if your gender identity is feminine and you express that in a feminine way, but you have a very masculine build, people are going to ask questions. And it may be important to look for a job that's going to be more accepting of those differences than forcing into a job that doesn't, and why that's important, right? It's the same way that company culture should be important to all of us when we get a job. And if I really want to work somewhere, but I don't like the way that the company is structured or the way that they treat their employees, I would choose not to work there. We can work with students in that same vein of, you don't have to change who you are. Who you are may limit opportunity. Here's how to look for different opportunities, which can be better opportunities as well, sometimes that our students have never experienced before. Because if I tell you, you have to go get a job, and you tell me nobody wants to hire a gay person, I can tell you you're wrong. How can I help you to see that there are those opportunities out there for you?
Today's been an awesome podcast, Joshua. We've had the opportunity to learn a lot in terms of the LGBTQIA plus community. And as we kind of circle back, there's a lot of different topics we've been able to cover. And I appreciate you taking the time to really educate and give us some more perspective, especially with some things that maybe someone didn't know about prior.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the platform to spread some information. That's awesome.
And speaking of platforms, there's so many different ones that we have, social media to the website. I'm going to hit you the website first, then we'll go to the others. IntegratedInterventionsLLC.com is the website. You can also check us out on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Like, subscribe, all the things that add to the user experience. Please come check us out. For Joshua Westby, I am Patrick Dundas, Integrated Interventions Director of Education. We'll catch you next time.